Okay, it's 7 o'clock, and we'll open this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. First item of business is citizen comments. So unless some citizens are hiding under the seats that we're not seeing, I don't believe there are anybody here to render comment. Next item is approval of the April 16th Planning Commission meeting minutes. So entertain a motion. Second.
I second.
Any discussion on those minutes? See none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes pass unanimously.
Just a clarification, I wasn't at that meeting, so I didn't vote on the minutes.
Okay, the vote then is 6 to nothing for the record. You abstained, I believe, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Dennis. Next item is critical areas and shoreline master program amendments. So invite up our city staff and consultants to lead us into that.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So there are two items on your agenda this evening, but the first one we're going to start with is the Critical Areas and Shoreline Master Program amendments. And if you recall, you had a public hearing and you gave direction on those amendments. So tonight we're going to be asking you to take a look at one last amendment, so a last minute thing that we've come in, and we just want to make sure that you're aware of that, and then also discuss your roles at the joint meeting on May 13th. So those are the two items. So I'm going to turn it over to Laurie to go over the additional amendment.
Okay. Good evening. So, as you know, the day before you adopted the amendments last time, we had communication with the Department of Ecology, and they had recommended some changes, and you made those changes and adopted them into your recommendation. And as one part of those changes were reduced wetland buffers. They rejected the opportunity to reduce a buffer if you provided enhancement, and instead, so we eliminated that option, and you endorsed that. And then the second piece was reduced standard buffers. And we thought that was a little mysterious. So we went back and read through the best available science guidance. And as we were reading it, it became pretty evident that what the Department of Ecology was anticipating was that if you had a reduced buffer that was degraded, it was filled with non-native vegetation, or it was lawn or any other kind of degradation, the expectation was that you would enhance that buffer. So there was already an assumption that your reduced buffer was enhanced. It's kind of the same thing, only in reverse. But we didn't have language in the recommendation to you that talked about enhancing these smaller buffers if they were degraded. So what we are bringing forward tonight is a new section that talks about degraded buffers and increasing buffer widths if an applicant chooses not to enhance a degraded buffer. We looked at rules in Kirkland and Shoreline, some who had recently updated their regulations, and they contained similar provisions, not exactly the same, because there were two things we were concerned about, and do you mind, I'll have Amy go over the illustrations, but the two things we were concerned about were, first, at what point would you suggest that someone who is making an improvement do something to a degraded buffer? What was the threshold for requiring action? And the second part was, how do you make sure that whatever they're doing is proportional to their impact? In other words, is it really fair if someone's putting a small addition on their house, for example, to require them to enhance a whole degraded buffer? And we did not feel that was the case. So the language in front of you, and that's in in your attachment, attachment 1 to your memo, clarifies what we think proportionality and reasonableness means. And then we have a couple of illustrations that I think will help, because this language is a little bit difficult to follow. So,
And do we need to project them, or are they just paper on your?
are the, no, we need the, how do I get out of this?
On the mouse, you should just be able to scroll.
It's not in the packet.
Oh,
Those were the two separate illustrations.
You can go, Sarah.
I'm sorry.
Here we go. Maybe that'll get us there. Here, file. Here we go. Maybe I can get out of here. So it's the two graphics. Yeah, okay, here we go.
All right.
That's okay. That's all right.
So we'll just quickly walk through. We prepared two scenarios. So this first one is an existing single-family home. It's proposing an addition of a 500 square foot increase in impervious surface area on the property. And to compensate for that, let's see here, it's still hard to see. Let me just move it down a little bit. Okay. Okay. Maybe even a little more. What we've sort of diagrammed out then is that we have some area of the buffer that is currently functioning, and then we've identified, and that's the crosshatch area, what the degraded buffer elements are. And we've also indicated that there are, in this example, two non-conforming legal structures. And one of the things we did make clear in the proposed regulations is that we're not requiring people to convert or remove or in other ways eliminate an existing legal non-conforming use. So it's sort of degraded areas outside of those legal non-conforming uses would be potentially available to enhance. The proportionality that we're proposing is just a straight kind of one-to-one based on the net increase in impervious surface on the property outside the buffer, and then you would compensate for that same square footage of buffer enhancement, presuming that that area is available. So that's fairly simple. Any kind of questions about how that would work? It would be up to the applicant to sort of through their critical areas report and a qualified professional to determine what areas are degraded versus not, and then to determine what makes the most sense for the site in terms of which 510 square feet in this example you would propose to enhance. So there is still a fair amount of flexibility, but some of the other examples that we looked at in terms of regulations and Ecology's model example don't have sort of any proportionality concept included at all. So like Lori said, if you were maybe going to remodel something, that might be enough that you would suddenly have to redo and enhance it in, you know, thousands of square feet of degraded buffer potentially. So we wanted to eliminate that. This next example is pretty similar.
Can I ask a question as you
Oh.
move to the next one?
Sure.
Can you remind me what some examples of enhancements would be?
Yes, so we describe the primary enhancement is simply to remove non-native or invasive vegetation and then just replace it with appropriate native vegetation. So that's the primary one. And then we also kind of encourage or allow additional habitat structures to be installed. So things like a snag or some downed wood, which provides habitat for amphibians or birds, that sort of thing. Bat boxes or bird boxes, those are all kind of within the realm of enhancements that we would be most likely to see, I think, in proposals that applicants would submit. We don't close the door on more robust enhancements, but if you do anything else to the wetland that disturbs the soil or might change the hydrology, then you would be looking at some additional permitting, probably not just with the city, but also with state and federal agencies as well. But our sort of what we expect most commonly is to address vegetation and then maybe to introduce some additional habitat components that don't interfere with the hydrology or otherwise, you know, disturb the soil.
And when we talk about habitat enhancements, is there a formula for how large a surface area a habitat enhancement affects? For example, a bat box or down trees for amphibians?
Oh, we
Those
did,
by themselves are relatively small devices, right? But they
Right.
affect a larger area, and that's how somebody
Right.
might get to that one-to-one
yeah, we
ratio.
didn't assign any sort of a square footage equivalency to those particular structures. So it would just be, perhaps if you're, to some degree, it's just going to be maybe a bit of an iterative process, or it's really going to depend on the qualified professional and the site-specific conditions. Because if your degraded condition is less degraded than someone else's degraded condition, then in order to argue that you've got an increase in ecological function, or to really demonstrate some sort of an ecological lift, you might find it necessary to throw in some of those additional habitat enhancements. But we didn't want to make it formulaic with those, because it would be really hard to figure out how much square foot a bat box is, or a snag, or a piece of downed wood. So
So it sounds like there's flexibility in the application
Yeah,
process
yeah.
to make it appropriate.
right, yeah, I think every one of these could turn out very differently depending on the existing condition, the particular professional, the homeowner's own objectives. And maybe they're really into birds, and so they might want to do bird boxes, or they might choose plant species that have more bird forage opportunities, that sort of thing. So
Thank you.
in this next example of a commercial building, similar concept, but in this scenario, they're adding 2,000 square feet, and so you'd want to compensate with 2,000 square feet of enhancement. Our example only has 1,200 square feet of available degraded buffer to enhance. You can see, again, we've indicated that there's legal, non-conforming degraded buffer and existing pavement or parking. And then there's 1,200 square feet of degraded, and then the rest of it is functioning. In that situation, we would expect the applicant to investigate whether or not the adjacent wetland, there are opportunities there to sort of provide the total enhancement area that is required. So in this scenario, you'd have 1,200 feet of buffer enhancement and 800 square feet of wetland enhancement to make up your total 2,000. And similar actions, again, it would be habitat structures if an applicant chooses to do so, but primarily we're anticipating that it would be native invasive vegetation removal and replacement with native vegetation. We did include sort of an encouragement for folks to consider at least removing existing legal nonconformances where it fits in with their proposal, and if it's an opportunity, but we're not requiring anyone to do so in these regulations.
Yeah, the other thing I might point out, and it was probably most clear on the single-family option, is that we put a 500 square foot threshold, so that if what you're doing is creating less 500 square feet or less of impervious surface, you don't have to address this issue. It's if you're creating more than that, and then again, there are these options for you to consider. In response to Mike's question, I will say that and Amy may disagree with me, but I can imagine no scenario in which putting a snag in your degraded buffer is going to be adequate to consider it enhanced. I mean, it's...
I would just think it would be a nice supplement.
Right, exactly. So it's certainly more robust than that, and they would just fall in line with any of our mitigation plans, which require a 5-year monitoring and maintenance period. Now, what if you don't want to do any of that? Well, then your buffer's increased by 33%, which actually takes you back to kind of the old buffers. And so in this scenario, if the 510 square feet that you wanted to put right there was in the new buffer, you wouldn't be able to do that without a variance, probably. I mean, to go to a larger buffer, then your impervious surface is now in the wetland buffer. So did you all have any more questions about this change? I think what we were hoping was to get some feedback from you about it. We thought it might be confusing to introduce it on May 13th, so our intent was to introduce it to the council after your joint meeting. I think they're going to meet again on May 20th. And then we would present this and acknowledge that you all had seen it and would be interested to know whether you are supportive or not.
I just had a quick question. So Kirkland and Shoreline, is this the same, similar? I mean, are there any variations that are sort of Kenmore specific on this?
Kirkland's rules have a very strict threshold, and we did not feel that it was proportional, so that there were, like, if you were over, I think, 1,000 square feet, you had to enhance the whole buffer, regardless of how big that buffer might be. And Amy was aware of a certain project, a school, I think. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, so it was a problem with a school redevelopment, in which there's many of those going on, and there was a small buffer intrusion, and as a result of the way the code was written, the requirement was for them to revegetate the entire buffer. And on a 40-acre site that had a wetland and a stream that basically traversed the whole property, that was a significant financial investment, as well as they did not include language that precluded or didn't force you to remove or protect the legal nonconformances. And so the ball fields, the playground, those types of things that were historically and have been in the buffer, those regulations would required them to reforest that area, essentially. So our version provides that 500 square foot threshold and then a 1-to-1 proportionality, so that you would never be in a situation of making a small improvement and suddenly having to do a very expensive and extensive buffer enhancement, as well as making sure that legal nonconformances can remain in play.
And what I remember of shorelines, I have the wrong notebook, so I don't have my shoreline stuff right in front of me, but what I remember from that is that there was the provision for you to do an increased, it included the same, increase your buffer by 33% unless you enhance your degraded buffer, but it wasn't as clear, and there was not a threshold, and the 1-to-1 proportionality was not incorporated. So it was a little more vague. Kirkland's was a little more restrictive, so we tried to hit this middle ground.
Could you say a little more about why we wouldn't include this with the initial presentation to the City Council? Why we have to do this separately?
Yeah, we could include it with the presentation to the City Council, but for one thing, they wouldn't have seen it. It's not, the packet's already gone out to the City Council, and so I think our thought was it's going to be a significant presentation anyway, because it's such a vast amount of material. So rather than muddy the water with yet another amendment to the amendments, we thought it might be more useful for you all to go ahead and present, and then we know there's going to be a follow-up meeting, and we could say at that point, we want to bring forward this, which the Planning Commission has considered.
Thank you.
And I will add one other thing, because this is kind of outside the scope of what your public hearing considered, we are intending to suggest to the City Council that they will have to hold a public hearing on at least this piece of this.
That's what I was
Yeah,
seeing if we
and
could avoid.
potentially any other changes that they might want to make that are outside the range of what you all considered.
So can we ask you, when you do present this at the end of our joint meeting, are you going to wait to bring this topic up until the next council meeting?
Yeah, that was our intent. I mean, if you don't want us to do that, we can present it that night. We just thought it was yet another piece of information that they would not have seen in advance of the meeting.
I'm fine with you doing that. I can't speak for everyone else, but I would really like, when you present this, that you remind them that it's an element of those amendments that has not received a public hearing.
Yeah, definitely.
So, even though we're probably not going to check up on you and see if that happens, but I'd like to ask you to do that just for the citizens who might be interested in this.
Yeah, I had a question. I know, I'm sure this is going to be a case-by-case excuse me, process, but do you have any sense of, are most people going to go ahead with the enhancements or go with the increased, increased buffer? Do you have any sense of how that's going to, in other words, what's going to be sort of the practical effect of?
I think people are going to do enhancements.
That's gonna be
And the
easier?
reason I
Okay.
think that is because we presented information to ecology. Remember, we used to have the bigger buffers, and we said you can reduce those buffers if you enhance. And Development Services has told us that most people do that if they have a degraded buffer, that they reduce their buffer and they enhance it. So this is the exact opposite, whereas now you have a reduced buffer, but if it's degraded, either you enhance it or you have to increase it. You see, it's kind of the same thing. So I think we'll see the enhancement of the degraded buffers because it more closely fits with
Okay. So it would be a
current
net
practice.
ecological gain. Is that fair to?
Yeah, there
Fair to
should
say?
be.
I mean, based on what you've presented? Okay.
Yeah. If people take advantage, or don't take advantage of it, but if people do enhance the buffers, then over time, we will see a net increase. I'm wondering if a number of people might look at the 500 and design their project to be 499. That might also happen. But, it's human nature. But I think there's probably still enough projects and commercial and, other sorts of land uses where you will definitely see more of this and maybe a little bit less so in shoreline residential, perhaps. People are hard to predict.
Any other comments or questions or Commissioner Olson?
This is more of a type question. In page 1 of attachment 1, second line, it would appear that you haven't stricken out enough words.
I'm not following you.
So that reads,
Is it in the definition or in the, does,
the 18.20.685,
665, yeah,
right at the top,
right?
the second line,
Mhm.
is stricken, adequately projected to
Right.
adjacent wet, and then you don't strike land due to.
Oh, that is stricken. I'm not sure. Maybe in,
Sorry, mine didn't come through on my print.
yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, any other comments or questions or? So are you looking for, you want us to endorse or consider endorsement? Do you need a vote or do you just
That
need
would be
us
nice.
to nod our heads?
Yep.
I'll make a motion in consideration with this new bit of information for this amendment that we, as a planning commission, accept what the city staff has recommended and that we say yes.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion?
Just a quick question. So these amendments are in response to feedback from ecology, yeah?
Yes and no. So the feedback from ecology was to change the buffers, and they didn't explicitly call out the fact that we were not requiring enhancement of degraded buffers, but it's included in their materials. And when we went back to look at it, then staff said, okay, well, we don't have that.
Right.
So we started to bring it forward, and then ecology was in contact with us. And so they've looked at it and vetted it, and they're
That was my only
fine with
question.
it.
Has,
Yeah,
since they gave the feedback and we made the updates, they've seen it yet again.
yes,
Perfect.
correct. They've seen this,
Good.
correct.
Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously.
So the next item would then be to kind of discuss your roles on at the joint meeting in terms of what each of you would like to present. Staff will typically give a background overview of what the project is about, including the public process of what's gone through. So it's up to you then if you want to select a particular topic and present that to the council. I'm getting some blank stares. Yes.
I'm waiting for more.
So I think that so I mean I think you can sort of think back to what were some of the particular issues where you may have had some more broader policy discussion. What are some of the topics where maybe there was a lot of public input? So whether it's somebody wants to talk about the changes we've made to the wetlands or the stream buffers in compliance with ecology, or whether it's the public agency utility exception, or I think there were some earlier comments or concerns that you raised with respect to the heron buffer. These are just things I'm sort of pulling off that are sort of remembering that there may be some more. And Laurie, am I missing anything that you can think of?
So I had forwarded to all of you the city council packet, and so attachment A, or I'm sorry, exhibit A, to that agenda bill was a list of sort of a summary of proposed amendments. And so the ones that from our perspective were ones that were more controversial or had more input or were more dramatic were again the public agency and utility exception. There was public comment about that. The wetland and stream rating and typing, and then the changes to the buffers to conform with the state agencies. The prohibition of development in high landslide hazard areas. You remember that now if you're going to develop there, you have to get a reasonable use exception permit. You can't just outright develop in that type of an area. And then in the shoreline, the new Swamp Creek commercial environment. Again, I'm not suggesting that you have to talk about all these. These are just ones that I thought you might be interested in talking about. The water access structures, that was a huge change with all of the revised rules and definitions about docks and piers and boat lifts, et cetera. And then the new buffers for Swamp Creek and the river, where previously there weren't shoreline buffers at all, fell to the critical area buffers. So those were the ones that I had highlighted, but there are many.
Well, I'll just start. I think I wrote down a list too of some of the key issues, and again, it's stretched back many months, and had to really dig into my files here. But did you mention the habitats of importance in your list? I believe you did, right? So.
Debbie mentioned the heron habitat. I didn't, but you changed how you approached eagles.
Right.
Added pileated woodpecker.
And pileated, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Another couple birds off because the state has spoken.
Yeah, it could be. I would have to go back and look at the old
Yeah.
rules about that.
So I think, so what, are you going to basically summarize what you consider, I'm looking at the Exhibit A in the council packet, what's your plan for your overview?
Yeah, I certainly was not intending to go through every item, and whatever items you pick, I probably am not going to pick.
Okay.
So I would anticipate talking about why this project was started, what the timeline is for this project. I would mention the gap analysis, all that work that you reviewed initially. I would anticipate talking about the focus groups and the open house that was held last fall, and then how there's been a shoreline planner that's been following along, and Department of Ecology has been involved in looking at the drafts, as has FEMA for the flood regulation. Those are the kinds of things I was thinking of. So I wasn't planning to go through each one of these.
Items, okay.
If there are items that seem to rise to the top, but you don't want to talk about, I'm happy to do that.
Well, for the new, especially for Suzanne and Nathan, the way we've often done this in the past, and we can obviously do whatever we choose in terms of presenting it. Yeah, staff does their summary, and we as a collective will highlight certain things that we want to for the council's benefit. Yeah, again, the policy and whatever. I don't think there was anything that was hugely controversial, but certainly some of the ones that were mentioned we should call out for the council. So it looks like there's about as many issues as there are commissioners. So my thought, and again, open discussion, is if we each took, one of these issues, and we could even, it could be a one paragraph summary. I mean, I don't know that we need to, I don't think they want to hear chapter and verse on every detail of every one of these, but does that sound like a reasonable approach if we all take one of these several issues? And Commissioner Vanderline.
I think it's a reasonable approach. I just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how much time do we think the city council is really going to have, and how much of that time should be they're asking us questions. They will have had this information in advance.
Good
and I'm
question,
sure would
yeah.
review it. So I wouldn't want us, lecturing to them about things that they're not particularly, wouldn't be top of mind, and not have time for them to ask us questions and for us to respond to things that were top of mind for them.
Yeah.
So I think a reasonable approach, alternative would be to have staff do as they suggested, basically lay out how did we exercise our due diligence on this, what sort of review did we get, and then ask the city council specifically if they had questions or areas that they wanted to ask us questions about, and then we could respond. And if we wanted to maybe take your approach and say, okay, we'll divide up these areas and say, okay, I will be responsible if the question gets asked about this to respond. I'll take the lead in responding to that. But we don't go through a whole litany of stuff that they may be okay with.
Did you have a
Well,
thought, Debbie?
I'll see if I can remember my thought.
I keep on talking, so remember your name at the end will be a shot.
No, I'm trying to. So, no, I'm trying to think through this here. So, I mean, typically for the staff presentation, we're probably looking at 10 minutes, 15 minutes tops for to kind of give that overview presentation. So I would say if the commission wanted to take, another 15, 20 minutes, that's fine. So I think if you even look at, it's probably going to be less than 5 minutes apiece. So again, it's not really looking for an in-depth analysis. It would be probably saying, picking a topic and going, here's whether it's talking about, say, for example, the ratings. So we amended the ratings to be consistent with ecology, and this seemed to make more sense to do that, and it kind of fell in line with best available science. I mean, 2 or 3 sentences and you're done. And then if they have questions to follow up on any of those topics, it gives council more time. So that was my thought. So I don't want to make it sort of a scary process for the commission, but I think it's really just kind of hitting a topic and giving maybe 2 or 3 bullet points and calling it good.
Right.
And all you're doing is calling the council's attention to some of those main topic areas, and then giving council the opportunity to ask questions. So if that helps in any way in terms of timing or what the expectation is, then that's fine. Like I say, and the staff will just kind of give, as Laurie kind of outlined, what our outline would be, which is more on the process and agency involvement and public feedback. So I guess if that seems like a reasonable approach, then I guess it would be deciding between you if you have a favorite topic to pick, and if that's the case, then we can keep track of who's saying what, and maybe follow up with an email just to let you know. And if any of you have questions about what you would like to say or anything, we're certainly happy to help with that, so you don't feel like you have to also then dig through a lot of the material. So if you need help putting those bullet points together, we're happy to do that too.
Okay. I appreciate what Commissioner Van Line said about questions. I think that's really important to give them opportunities to ask questions. I do think maybe Debbie's approach will help stimulate questions. So if we can do something like that, again, a very brief summary, and I assume there's plenty of time for questions to the extent they
Yeah.
want to ask them.
I can throw out one other idea. I think the idea of picking topics that you're wanting to focus on is a good one. An alternative approach, I don't know whether this is easier or harder, would be to sort of divide out by topic. So wetlands, streams, fish and wildlife habitat, geologically hazardous areas, flood regulations. And then again, just a couple sentences of introduction about those. I don't know whether that's better or worse. It's just another way to think about it. And I don't know which one you like.
And really, it's kind of a formality. I mean, the work has been done, but part of what I think we're doing is we're in front of the public. It's a publicly recorded meeting, and it helps the public know that there's been this process of work that this advisory board has done, and being able to say something about the work to the commissioners is great. They may ask us a question that we might not have the answer to, and it's okay to just say, you know, off the top of my head, I don't remember the details of that particular item, but we're pretty sure you'll get into it once you open the packet and really start chewing on it. Because will they go through, don't they go through pretty quickly and zero in on these more controversial items just to make sure that the direction we're recommending really is what the council wants to do?
Well, I think what, in the packet, as Laurie said, we've given sort of a summary of proposed amendments. So
Yeah.
I would assume as a council member, as you're going to get a massive packet to look
like
through, that you
300
would
pages.
start there and kind of look at those topics and figure out, looking at those then, where you would want to initially focus your attention. Because, you know, that's I mean, I don't know, that's how I would work if I was reviewing a huge packet, is kind of figure out which one I really wanted to find out more about and look at that section first. So, and each council member, kind of like the commission, is probably going to have an area where they're more interested in focusing.
I might also point out, when you have a chance to look at that city council packet, Exhibit D, which is the last exhibit, is a list of frequently asked questions. And that was prompted by a desire on the part of some of the council members to have a more full description of some of the items. I don't know that there are any frequently asked questions about anything that's not in the summary of recommended amendments. But for example, there'd been a lot of conversation heard from the public and elsewhere about why was the heron buffer changed. So that was an FAQ, and we provided more information about that. So some of those more complicated topics we tried to expand on in that Exhibit D.
Okay. Invite others to weigh in on, at least on the thoughts about the approach we should take. It's certainly a group decision here, so.
Well, I think it's a good idea to call out the things that are in these recommendations that are kind of controversial, because they're the ones that we spent the most time on. It's a delicate balance of how you do that, though, because you don't want to light a fire. You just want to call it out that this is a change, and the reason we want to make this amendment is because it's helping us comply with the Department of Ecology. And most of the amendments really were like that, with a few exceptions. Mm-hmm.
Have any thoughts, you gentlemen over here?
I have no new ones.
No new ones, okay.
No new thoughts.
Nathan?
I know that since I haven't been here or been on this project since the very beginning.
Sure. Do you feel that way too, Suzanne? Do you feel like, I know you weren't in on the, some of the earlier ones.
Right, well, I feel that if I was assigned a section that I had questions about, I could ask our experts to fill
Yeah.
me in.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think it's a sound approach, what they've described, so
okay,
I'm all in.
okay. Okay, so do we have a consensus that we'll each take one of these items, we'll do, like they said, 2 or 3 bullet points, might take 2-3 minutes apiece, roughly, and if we need help, we can certainly rely on our excellent city staff here to help fill in any gaps we may have. So is there an agreement that that's what we'll do, and then we'll stimulate, hopefully, questions? Does that sound?
Just want to clarify, I am not going to be able to make
Oh,
that meeting.
okay, on Monday, okay.
And I also wanted to let you know that Amy will be there, our scientific expert.
okay.
So
She will be there?
she will be.
Okay. Okay, so with agreement on the approach, I guess we basically need to come up with 6. It's a little bit of an arbitrary number, but I think we can probably, that's pretty close to what I think we've highlighted so far. So do we want to talk about what we think the top 6 are? Any?
I think that's a good conversation to have.
Okay. Do you want to go through the list, and I'll tell you what, I will go through the list, and maybe you guys can all share how important you think it is. Certainly the public, the PAUE, what's the acronym?
Public agency and utility
Utilities
exception.
Okay, PAUE as we're known. To me, that was one of the top 6. Okay, so we got PAUE. The wetlands ratings and buffer and enhancement, I thought was obviously another. That's 2. The habitats of importance, the eagles and herons and pileated woodpeckers, I thought was significant. I guess the landslide hazards, we called it wasn't under the geologic hazards. I think is that the same? That's the same. Okay.
Yes.
I thought that was another one that we wanted to highlight. Then the flood hazard development standards and definitions, I also had that in mind. And then Swamp Creek Commercial. That was my top 6, but I would certainly entertain Commissioner Vanderline.
No, I think those are good, and I'd volunteer for the slopes, critical area.
Critical areas, okay, we're calling that,
What are we
what are we
calling
calling
it?
that?
Geological hazard?
Geological
Geological
Okay.
hazard areas.
And the zoning requirements related to that.
Okay.
Yep.
Mike, Commissioner Vanderline, that is all yours. Do you live on one of those?
Yeah. If you remember, I actually
That's right.
excused myself,
Okay, yeah.
disclosed, and so that didn't keep me from commenting.
Okay.
It won't this time either.
You don't need to, yeah.
So it'll be 2 or 3 bullet points.
You have
Very
experience, okay, so. Okay.
I'd be happy to do the wetlands designations and the
Okay.
change, the ratings that we used.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you, Commissioner Baker.
I'll do habitats of importance.
Okay, that would be good. Thank you, Commissioner Greathouse.
I'm happy to take Swamp Creek Commercial.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So Nathan, it's you and I. We got the flood hazards, and we have the PAUE. I will defer to youth in this regard, so you choose.
I'd like to select the PAUE, please.
Got it, okay.
I think if you can just remember what it stands for, you halfway through your presentation.
Pretty much done. There you go. Okay, so just to clarify there, so Nathan has the PAUE, Carol has the wetlands, Suzanne has habitat, Mike V has geological hazards, I have flood hazard development standards and definitions, and Mike M has the Swamp Creek Commercial. Is that everybody's Understanding? Great. We have a plan. And you say again, 2, 3 bullet points, 2, 3 minutes, okay.
Yeah, and I would say you could probably start looking at, I would look at the council packet and look at Exhibit A, and is it D, the other one?
D was the.
Yeah, so Exhibit A and Exhibit D might give you some good pointers.
Are all of these on Exhibit D? So they could refer to them in the same way? It'd be nice if we could maybe point the council at Exhibit D and work our way
Yeah,
through it.
the FAQs I don't think line up perfectly, but you can pull them out pretty easily.
Right. I unfortunately do not have Exhibit D right in front of me.
Yeah, I do right here. You can.
Ugh. So.
Pretty-
You want to talk about the docket and all the
Should we
things
figure
down
out
there?
the order in which we present
Or-
these? We probably should. Or does it
Yeah.
matter? What,
We could pull, maybe we could pull. Can you help, Bridget? So let's try and pull up the council packet and see what Exhibit D says. And then, I don't think it, you know, you can pick whatever order you like. And if you want to leave it as you have currently, that would be fine, or you can mix it up. So if you want to change the order, let me know, so, or how you currently went through it. So right now you have PAUE, wetlands, habitat, landslide, flood hazard, and Swamp Creek commercial. I don't think there's anything magical about order, so.
does that sound good? Everybody,
So,
everybody's got that order so they know when
Is that
they're,
going to be in the agenda, or will we see that list so we could
I don't think so, right?
be nervous and have trepidation until the moment? But
They want to hear from us, so.
Smile a lot.
So I think I can call up Exhibit D. We'll see how quickly this lets me get in here. Here we go. So this is what the council packet looks like, and you can see that Exhibit D. Oh, hey, guess what? It wasn't D. It's Exhibit C. So right. So
that's what I was thinking
D.
of, just line up with our list.
Nathan might be really interested in D, which is the PAUE Best Available Science Report. So Exhibit C, so here are the questions. So here's PAUE,
That's number one.
so that would
Nice.
be,
That's
here's
lining up
wetland
nicely.
buffers. Okay, where am I here? And
Oh,
then
fish and wa-
there's fish and wildlife
Yeah.
habitats, there's bald eagle and heron.
Not
Here's
yet.
high landslide hazard areas.
Yeah.
And then Swamp Creek Commercial.
What?
So have we,
I don't think there's anything on there in flood hazard, that's the only
right.
one.
Yeah, so it may be that flood hazard is the only one. And one thing that I would suggest if I were doing flood hazard is just really to note the importance of the flood hazard regulations for the National Flood Insurance Program, so people can get flood insurance. And that therefore, you know, we took 2 different chapters of flood hazard regulations and mashed them together. And then we went through maybe 3 rounds of review with FEMA to make sure that these regulations would continue to meet the flood insurance program requirements. So.
It'd be nice if that last one was in there, but I was thinking it might be useful if, when we started, we just point the city council at Exhibit C, and then we talk about them in the order in Exhibit C, so you have kind of a natural order to go through, and they've got something in front of them they can look at. And add the wetland piece that's missing at the end. Flood.
Yeah, okay. We'll revise the order based on or make sure we're consistent. So we do have PAUE first, then we have wetlands, then we have, well, we have stream buffers, but that's part of, then we have habitat, we have geology, we have Swamp Creek Commercial, so Mike M and I should
Swap.
swap. Swap order, right. Gotcha. Will do, I'll be the cleanup hitter.
There you go.
Well, not really, 6 isn't cleanup, right?
I guess 4 would be clean.
Okay, are we good? Everybody good? Anybody got questions or? Great, thank you everybody for participating. I think the council will appreciate hearing from all of us, and hopefully they'll have some questions, and if we don't know the answers, we will say so or ask city staff and the consultants to.
Thank you
Just
for
a-
helping us get that up over there.
A thought for the future, when we do the next one of these, it would be nice when the staff puts together its package for the council. It does something similar to Exhibit C then too, and so that would give us the order, and we wouldn't have, we continually have the same discussion whenever we're going to go to a city council presentation. It'd be nice if we could agree that that's what we're going to do, is we're going to have an Exhibit C that's going to call out the major issues. They're going to have some description in there that the staff has put together that summarizes the points, and then we each can just take one of those, and we don't have to use commission time unless something comes up that thinks we have to change that, but it might be a little more, have that consistency, and also build the recognition in the city council that that's what they're, when they see that consistency, that may help.
Yeah, we can do that.
Sounds like a good idea. Okay, so we are, I believe, done with that agenda item. And on to phase 2 of the Manufactured Housing Communities Project.
Well, I think for most of you, are familiar with and have worked on this project, or have seen some of the information presented to council. And so the council recently adopted an ordinance putting in the mobile home park zoning over the 6 parks. So that ordinance was adopted. And then there was a corollary resolution adopted, which basically is giving you a work program item to say, look at the 4 parks north of SR 522 and bring back recommendations for phase zoning. So looking at after 10 years of having that in effect, what happens after 10 years? So your next task is to figure out what happens after 10 years, what zoning will go into place, considering an increase in density because they've had that 10 years. So we're going to kind of give them a bonus at the end of an increased density, but also requiring an affordability requirement. So that's in a nutshell what you'll be working on, and there are some policy questions I think that we want to bring forward tonight to kind of give direction for how that conversation will go. So that's a quick overview, and hopefully I haven't kind of said too much or too little. I'm going to turn it over to Laurie to get into some of those questions.
Right. So the important document in your packet was the resolution that the City Council passed. And you'll recall that one of the options that the Planning Commission considered last year was an upzone with affordability requirements. So in a way, what this would be doing is enacting that option for the 4 parks north of 522. The issue is that it's intended to happen after 10 years. And rather than requiring a landowner, for example, to come in and ask for a rezone, what we're thinking about is putting in place what's called a phased zoning so that it automatically changes in 10 years. So we'll be looking at issues, we anticipate that there'll be an even greater need for housing in this area, particularly with the arrival of bus rapid transit. So those are the kinds of topics that we would look at, for example, if we were doing a revised comprehensive plan language to support this phase zoning, what is it about the future that makes us think that the upzoning with affordability requirements is important? And then looking at what should the standards be? What should this upzoning look like? What should the requirement for affordable housing be? And so Mike Stanger with Arch is coming to your next meeting, and he is going to talk about economic feasibility. And so I want to call your attention to the last page of this packet, and it is a chart that was done by Arthur Sullivan. Let's see if I can get this up here. Oh, yes. Could you flip the? There we go. Okay, this is small, but this was a chart that Arthur Sullivan did where we were looking at the different parks and how many existing units are there, what's the current density, how many units could you get under existing zoning, and then this next set of things is an affordability analysis, how many you're trading off the number of units versus the affordable requirement to determine what makes something economically feasible, because you don't want to put in place a zoning that nobody could build under. That's not the point. We want something that someone could build to and have a project that would be viable. So on the second page of the staff memo, we've identified 3 policy questions for you to start thinking about. I don't know that we'll be in a place to come to a resolution on any of these tonight, but you may have some preliminary discussion about them or preliminary thoughts or questions that we could be prepared for. So the first one is the whole question, should the number of affordable units provided through the redevelopment match the number of existing units in the parks? We don't know the affordability levels really of the units in the parks. We can make some estimations. But, for example, to replace the existing units in the parks, these numbers show you how many units would need to be provided. Okay, so that's the first question. The second one, is there a maximum density that should be considered? For example, the highest density in the city is in the Transit-Oriented Development District, the TOD, and that you can achieve as much as 150 dwelling units per acre if you provide affordable housing. So is it appropriate to think of even higher densities than that, or should that be a cap? Do we want more of a staggered view? The current density, for example, downtown is 48 dwelling units per acre. So that there's a range there that's fairly dramatic, but we want to do an upzone. So that's a question, and this provides information on what the current, they're not the current density is 12 units per acre in the manufactured housing community zone, but it was formerly 48 or 24, depending on the location. And then the third question to think about is what level of affordability should be targeted, and that's where Mike provided some information, generalized information about the parks, and so we can look at that. We could also look at where are we in terms of it being of a city in relation to the county-wide expectations for affordable housing. That would be another way to look at it. So these were 3 questions that we'll have to answer at some point, and so I would ask if you have any initial reactions or if you have questions that these 3 items prompt that we should be prepared to come back to you with.
Commissioner Vanderlaan.
I think these are the right questions. These are good questions. But I get concerned with trying to anticipate what the city's needs or the community's needs would be 10 years into the future. To me, that's always a risk factor, and it's a risk factor that increases as you become more concrete in what you put into your statute. So what I'd be asking is, what's the flexibility to be able to, we got 10 years out, and downtown in this area, and the units we're looking at here are very close to downtown, is going to look very different than it does right now. So I may anticipate that residential may not be the best interest of the community to be there. It may be something else. And this is all hypothetical because the future is hypothetical. But so I'm wondering, how do we build a linkage in what we do here to some of the flexibilities we've created in some of our other zoning? So what's the link to things like in lieu of, where you could do transfers, things like that, so that if the future looked very different and it was really in the community's interest to have something else there, have that affordable housing, which I agree we'll still need, but we have the flexibility to do that where in a location would be more appropriate if these weren't the appropriate areas for it in the future.
Commissioner Mulcair, do you have?
I did, yeah. I just was hoping for a reminder in question number 2 when we say that the current density for each of these 4 MHCs is 12 units per acre. So that's under the current new mobile home community zone,
Correct.
manufactured home community zone. Formerly 48, that was prior to that resolution.
Right.
Right? What
Prior to the ordinance.
ordinance
Right.
and the moratorium. And the question then is 48 the appropriate number, or anything up to 150, or potentially even beyond that, yeah?
Yes, that's correct.
And this might be a better question for Mike next week, but greater density would be achieved by going higher, generally, as opposed to smaller?
So it could happen either way. We certainly can bring back information on the height limits. There's a fairly robust height limit in the downtown
Yeah.
area. And so height limits will be an important factor to consider. And then the city doesn't have any restrictions on the size of apartments. So, for example, microhousing, if they could meet the density, maybe the envelope doesn't have to be as big. So maybe some information about that would be useful.
Right. And there's no requirement around parity that the affordable units have to be of the same size as the full commercial price.
Parity is important.
It
That
is.
is, right. It is a,
Is that true across the street as well? And
I'm sure it was. I don't think the units are supposed to be generally the same size and sort of distributed through the development so that they're not standing out as unusual or
Right.
different. Yeah.
And one other question, and again, it's just something I should probably remember, but I don't. We had talked quite a lot in the mobile home community conversations about whether or not existing residents would have a right of first tenancy. And I remember our city council having an opinion on that would not be sustainable or defensible. Pardon?
Wasn't that the attorney? who had
Our
the
city attorney, yeah. So did that not become any part of the resolution that passed on April 15th?
They have not included that
Okay.
in the resolution, but
So that's
really the direction.
Not something we need to consider as we go through this process.
I
That
think
wasn't,
that would be a little bit outside the scope, although if you had a strong recommendation about that, I don't think there's any reason you couldn't make that. It had to do
we
with,
addressed it fully in the fall
yeah.
or last spring,
Yeah, I think we were interested in that,
Yeah.
correct?
but we relied on attorney.
Right, we weren't going to go against what the attorney, I believe, suggested, yeah.
We can also go back and check to see what the legal opinion was on that bit I
mean,
don't, I
think
don't
the
want to
scope of
guess,
this
but I,
is- Yeah, I think the scope of this is sufficient. I just wondered if any part of that persisted through the council.
no, it didn't. And what I can't fully recall is if that was based on sort of a legal opinion on the ability to offer first right of refusal. So we can kind of double check and bring that back just so that you have that information.
There were also, I remember, logistical challenges too.
Right.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
Because the timing would not work out.
that's correct. Yeah.
I guess just from being at the city council meetings when the mobile home residents were here speaking, and it seemed as though there were a couple of council members that had hoped that all of the parks would be treated the same, and they were very concerned about making sure that folks who would be displaced from the mobile homes after 10 years had a place to go. And so I'm trying to anticipate questions related to that and the fact that a lot of people may be on fixed income, and in 10 years, the median rate here may exceed what their fixed income is. And I know there has also been discussion about relocating people or relocating their homes and all of that. So I'm kind of wondering how all of those concerns that came up during the discussions, how we handle it when we talk about this, because it seems to take that sort of personal aspect out of it, which on the one hand, I think that's good. On the other hand, it's not something we can ignore. So I'm just looking for some guidance about that.
Right. So I can give you my perspective on that. First of all, the two parks on the south side, the intent is that those retain this zoning indefinitely, forever. So those, and many of the folks who testified, all the folks I think who testified, were from those parks. On the north side, the issue of treating all of the parks the same really got to the fact that the council was divided over whether the parks on the north and the parks on the south should be treated differently. And I think the conclusion on the north was that the vision for downtown is such that for the current time, for a decade, that's a long time, that the affordable housing was more important. But that at the end of that time, with the arrival again of transit and those things, that it probably made sense to upzone with affordability requirements. So I'm not sure that that exactly answers your question. The desire to have them all treated the same was one perspective, but that was not the dominant perspective. Did that sort of help?
I just think it will be an interesting conversation as we move forward with this.
Right.
Because it is such a personal decision that needs to be made for a lot of members of the community. And
Right.
they're very passionate about it. So, and
Right.
then the 10-year time frame, I think, is sometimes difficult for people to envision.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, those are all questions from the three commissioners that I've wanted to ask too, so I'm glad those have all come up. And this is kind of building a little bit on what Suzanne just mentioned. Is the intent here to provide in 10 years affordable housing, or is it to provide housing for the mobile home residents, or is that really kind of beyond the scope? Because that's one thing I'm not sure that we ever really concluded, at least in our recommendation. I mean, we certainly wanted to, thought about right of first refusal and giving opportunities to the current tenants and some kind of transitional plans, even though some of those weren't, able to be included. So I guess I'm wondering what the council's view is as we look at this on, again, are we supposed to be looking at affordable housing or supporting the current tenants, and who knows what happens in 10 years, but what's the sort of
I think-
philosophical framework?
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of...
Debbie
Kind of.
will offer her perspective on that, but my perspective on that was that there was a different vision for downtown in 10 years, and that it was important that affordable housing be a component of that, but that it was not intended necessarily for the current residents to move into the I mean, it would be available to them, certainly.
But it wasn't targeted to
I don't think
help
so.
them.
No, I think one thing that the council did, I think that was in the resolution, was to look sort of at a broad spectrum of affordability and looking at the feasibility of sort of the very, serving sort of the lower income level, so at 35% of median. But again, I don't think the direction was it all has to be the very low. So I think it's looking at a range. But I think there has to be some recognition that being able to guarantee that the current tenants would be able to necessarily move into this new, I don't think that was, I don't think that that's sort of the direction from council as you need to guarantee that. That was not specific. And I think that was one of sort of the issues that when the planning commission were going through that, it's sort of how it's sort of hard to come up with a proposal that you could guarantee the current residents be able to move into these new units in 10 years.
So I have a question. They've kind of basically made a resolution and an ordinance that protects these mobile home communities. So nothing will be done on these properties for at least 10 years. Is that my understanding?
The zoning would allow other things to be done. There are a number of uses that are allowed on the property, but they're uses that presumably would not provide the landowner the return that they would achieve from keeping the manufactured housing community there. So, for example, one single-family house on a lot, that's a permitted use. Or a family childcare home, that's a permitted use. And there are a number of different uses, so I suppose you can't say that nothing would ever change, but we do not anticipate that those uses would be such that the landowners would want to convert.
So if the individuals who rent those mobile home spots take their residence somewhere else, how is the city protecting for those in this ordinance for those circumstances? So if we're protecting the community to stay a community, but
Right.
like if the rent increases to rent the spot, how do we mitigate that?
We don't.
We don't,
can't do
okay.
rent control.
Okay.
Actually, one question that Suzanne asked is, well, what about transition assistance or something like that? What was the council thinking about that? And would the planning commission consider that? And that answer would be no, because that's direct financial assistance. And that's not within the planning commission's purview. That's a council decision. So if the rent increase is a concern, I think that is something that would have to go in front of the city council, and they certainly heard that, but again, there's no rent control, so unless it was rent assistance of some sort, I don't think that it will be addressed.
Okay.
There is a provision in the new zone that if a property owner could show that what was currently happening on their property was really economically infeasible, it's a series of difficult tests. If they could demonstrate that with hard facts, then the city would consider a rezone. But I don't know that, everything we've heard is that these parks are very profitable. And we certainly have heard from folks that they have no intention of converting the use. So, from some of the park owners.
Mr. Van der Laan.
Maybe following on a couple of context type of questions the other folks have asked, I'm wondering if there isn't a precursor to our number one here, which is, do we have an assumption, or should we make an assumption, are we looking to maintain the current level of affordable housing that's available through these parks, or are we looking to increase it? That, I think, is an important thing to have in mind, because that really begins to trigger some of your affordability questions. And as we get into the economic feasibility discussion, it would be good to know that, or at least have that in mind as we go through it, because I can see you're going to end up with a couple of simultaneous equations here. If we want to increase, if we want to have this number, or this level of affordable housing, we're going to have to make some compromises or some adjustments, for instance, to affordability perhaps, or to the levels that are in there, and how do you distribute low versus medium versus community. So I think that's something we need to discuss. And maybe, do we have any guidance from the city council on that? Are they looking to increase the number of affordable units, or are they looking primarily to maintain what's already there?
I think that the direction that came was that they wanted you for sure to study an alternative that provided very low income affordable housing. There was no direction on percentages of units or anything like that, but they did want you at least to consider that.
So it'd be interesting to hear when Arthur comes, how does that all play out in terms of how many, what's the maximum number of affordable units you could get, given the zoning that's reasonable, height restrictions and everything else? And what would that, how would that force the configuration in your decisions about the level of affordability?
Correct.
And still be economically viable? I think
Right.
that's going to be a tricky set of equations, and I think we need to know the opposite extremes of that.
Right. So a couple of points related to that. For those of you who don't know, Arthur Sullivan retired several months ago. So Mike Stanger, who has been at most of these meetings, is subbing in for him. And again, so he's the one that is going to be helping us with this analysis. I can't do the analysis, so we're going to really rely on Mike to know how to do that and how those pieces interplay, the density, the height, the zoning, and the affordability.
And attachment 6 in your packet sort of gives a sort of a first cut of that analysis, so you can kind of see how that might work out.
So I remember we had some of that discussion. We went
Yes.
through it the first time.
You did.
But we never really, I think, delved into that question of where is that range?
Yeah.
And what does it look
Right.
like, and what are those decisions? And I think
Right.
particularly with some newer people on the commission, we might want to revisit that whole
Yeah,
question.
we'll have to revisit
Particularly
it.
the trade-offs.
Plus, we're trying to come up with recommendations in the future. It's very hard to do.
It is hard to
Especially
do.
when the data we're working with, some of it is, I remember some of it was more than 10 years old.
Yeah,
I noticed in the new packet, he has some updated data,
right,
like from 2014, 5 years ago.
yeah,
But think of how much things have changed just in 2 years.
right.
So it's hard to know.
It is, but that's kind of what you have to do. There's always some assumptions, and you have to sort of recognize the data that you're working with, and you have to make that your best, not guess, but your best recommendation based on the data that you have and the information that you have in front of you, and that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
Does the council envision that there will be some revisiting of whatever we recommend and whatever they approve sometime between now and 10 years, to see how conditions may have changed? Or is that just wait and see, or?
So the council can change things at any
Sure,
point. That's
sure.
their prerogative.
Yeah.
I think the idea was that, if you remember this particular option with the phasing was, these landowners, some of whom are interested in redevelopment, are having to put their plans on hold. And at the end of a certain period of time, and 10 years was the chosen time, then they deserve something for that. So they deserve to have a higher density to make their project more viable or more valuable or whatever. As a trade-off, though, they have to provide some level of affordable housing. So the notion of the phase zoning, again, is that it goes into place now. I mean, the idea is that the council will adopt it, hopefully review the recommendations before their August recess, and then because there will be comprehensive plan amendments involved, they won't adopt until November, probably, but it would be off your plate sooner. And that then the zoning is automatic. So there's no intent that anybody's going to go back and revisit the zoning. On the zoning map, it'll say, like, this zone with this density is unlocked in 2029. So,
So if the zoning changes automatically, that doesn't necessarily trigger kicking people out of the mobile home park?
No, not at
and
all.
It could be that it could just stay a mobile home park for 20 more years.
It
Correct.
could,
Yeah.
right. It just means that that zoning goes into effect, and if somebody says, I don't want to make a change, they could certainly keep having it as a mobile home park as long as they wanted to, but they can't really do anything prior to that 10-year date.
And there's still the, isn't it the year-long notification? That's still state law, right, in terms of?
Yes,
So they can't
correct.
kick
For a
people out,
park
you know,
closure,
a week from
right.
now. So
There
there's
is-
always
there
got to
is-
be
yes.
a year. I think we talked about it, at least brought up the idea of, does Kenmore have the ability to extend that state mandated years notice provision? I can't remember where we ended up with that one.
yeah, and that, the council didn't bring that up. They just
Okay.
increased rent notification for apartments if that was increased by a
But
certain
not
amount.
for mobile home.
But this is actually related to closure, not rent increase. And it's possible that there was some state legislation in this last session about that, but I don't know that. For sure, it's at least a year.
Right, yeah.
Should we be making a list of some of the assumptions that we're going to continue or in anticipation of the end of the 10-year period? Seems like we don't want to lose those assumptions.
Assumptions about,
We've been talking about some of the assumptions of what is wanted at the end of the 10-year period.
right, the upzoning with affordability.
Right.
Right.
But I'm just thinking that that ought to be stated so that we don't lose track of that.
Mhm.
The other question sort of relates to, we do have, at least currently, the 1-year notice provision before they can close a park. When can that notice be given? Is it the end of the 10 years, or is it at the beginning or the end of the 9th year?
I think probably the end of the 9th year is, they'd have to provide a 1 year whenever it is. We do have a new requirement, I will say, that went into effect with the new zone, which is that, and I think the Planning Commission talked about this, the need for a transition plan, so that the owner of the park has to provide quite a bit of information to the tenants, and that plan has to be approved by the city and distributed before they can start their 1-year notice of approval. So that's something new that kind of extends the time period a little bit. But
Or if they do it in year 8?
right, exactly.
What is the permitting process or timeline if hypothetically somebody wanted to convert the park to a different use? I'm assuming they have to go through a pretty extensive permitting and planning process to submit that to the city.
Yeah, it will depend on other characteristics of the park. For example, the one, Kenmore Village, that's down by the bowling alley, that has a lot of critical area
Yeah.
issues. The others, less so. So some might just require a site plan review with a design review. Maybe that's a 6 or 8 month process. If they have to do critical area work, maybe that's a longer process.
So what I was kind of really getting at was there's going to be something out there in public notice
Sure, yeah, if they were doing
that
that.
people could have been anticipating in advance if this isn't going to be just a quick notice and done deal.
You know, one other thing that came up, at least as a possibility, was that the tenants could join together and buy the mobile home parks. Does this new zoning, the 10-year provision, does that have any effect on that possibility? So say that happened in, I don't know, X number of years, it wouldn't make any change to the underlying zoning. It would just be a new owner who,
Right,
the collective of tenants, or,
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's basically a change in ownership.
not underlying.
It wouldn't,
Zoning.
no, all it would be
Yeah.
doing is whether it's, one owner sells it to another owner, or whether the tenants band together and buy it, it's still just a change of ownership. It doesn't really relate to what the zoning is or the use would be.
Okay. Any other thoughts for tonight? Yeah.
So I think the other thing, I think it was an attachment 1 to this memo, was looking at the schedule going forward. So I think in terms of the mobile home parks, Laura, you were anticipating 3 meetings, is that right?
So what I was thinking here is that at next time, we would look at numbers. I had included in this packet even an example of zoning. So if there were aspects of that we could pick up and then just plug in whatever numbers you want, that might be a way to approach it. And then we'll also have to talk about some probably fairly minor comprehensive plan amendments that address the issue of phasing and the future of the area. So then I would anticipate part of next week's meeting and then the next meeting to talk about finalizing some preliminary recommendations, and then we'd hold the public hearing in July. So, and then at that point, I think the council was hoping to hear sooner rather than later. So maybe even at the end of July, presenting the recommendations to council. Again, this is a preliminary schedule. This is not to say if we get stuck that we can't shift things a little bit, but this is the ideal schedule.
And I think just if you're kind of wondering if these were presented to council in July, but council doesn't adopt them in November, if you're wondering why there's a gap there, the reason for that is you can only really adopt comprehensive plan amendments once a year. So as there could be other comprehensive plan amendments, for example, related to update of the park and recreation open space element in the comprehensive plan, they all have to be bundled together. So that's why there's sort of a gap in presenting the recommendation and the council adopting those, the ordinance.
And it's still fresh in everyone's mind, right? So we didn't want to put the gap at the beginning of the time period, but have everybody kind of on board and ready to go later in the year. So the other items that you knew were coming your way were the accessory dwelling units and incentives to office development. So we anticipate those will be fall items because really this charge and the pros plan are going to be taking up most of your time over the next few months. And we're having a few meetings where both topics are on the agenda, but we're also having meetings where just one topic is on the agenda. So.
So unfortunately, as you look at this, you can basically see that we're not giving you much time off.
So,
Yep, I'm sure. Nope. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the August 6th community outreach for the pros plan. So what would that be exactly?
I don't think we've actually fully kind of fleshed out what that will be, but as we're kind of updating the pros plan, we at least want to kind of report out to the community about what that update's all about. We also would want to kind of tell them what the results of the community survey was, and I think that's also on the May 13th meeting. So when you come to the council meeting, you'll kind of hear those results. So that's something that will go before the at the outreach. And then depending on where the commission is in their work or their recommendations, there might be some of that as part of that presentation as well. But we know that there has to be definitely some outreach, and we kind of set it in August because we figured you'd be far enough along where there might be, something for the public to react to or give feedback on.
Thank you.
Anything else for the agenda or for us tonight?
No, I don't think so. I do want to say that on the 13th, I can't remember if this is the first business item. It is. It's the first business item on the agenda. So the meeting starts at 7. There will be some council business ahead of your agenda item, but I would suggest that you still get there at 7.
Meaning an executive session prior to?
If there is an executive session, it's usually finished by 7, so I think the business is supposed to start at 7.
Okay.
And if you're there at 7, there might be cake as well, because the city, and I say this because the city attorney, Rod Casaguma, is retiring, and May 13th will be his last meeting, so there'll be some recognition of Rod, and I think there might be cake that appears, so.
Great. Another inducement.
Another inducement to show up. I'm just
There
trying
you
to kind of
go.
encourage you to show up.
Okay, well, unless there's anything else, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.